Kalimera and welcome to Stupid Ancient History, Stupid A Level Greeks. It's a cold winter's day, it's not raining, which is a nice change, and today we're going to look at the imaginatively titled Persian Wars Part 3, particularly the battles of Plataea and Maikali. And as always, a couple of disclaimers. So obviously, these podcasts are no substitute for reading the original text, the original sources, and particularly in this case Herodotus. To pass the A level you do need to know the specifics. The whole purpose of these videos is to look particularly at kind of the big themes and the overarching issues, so in the interest of time I'm not going to make it too long. I'm not going to go into too many of the specific details about, in this video for example, the Battle of Plataea. That's what Herodotus is for. And obviously one of the emphases we're going to look at throughout this series is going to be on Greek and non-Greek relations. So looking at the big picture shifts rather than the fine detail. So previously we've spent quite a lot of time looking at the events of the Persian Wars, and with good reason. There is a lot going on in the small space of time between 480 and 479. Already we've looked at events such as Thermopylae, Artemisium and Salamis, and we've looked at not just the battles in isolation, but how these events have exposed some deep cracks within the Hellenic League. If nothing else, that should be really clear by now. We've also looked at some of the quite seismic shifts in terms of alliances, allegiances that the Persian Wars bring about. Certainly last episode we looked at particularly the capitulation of Thebes. That's not going to go away. And obviously we've been looking at the particularly poor relations between Greece and Persia. They are in a war after all. So the next chunk of our story of the Persian Wars picks up in the following year, in 479. This is the year after the Battle of Salamis. And Mardonius, the Persian general, he's spent the winter in Greece with a force of roughly about 300,000 men. Obviously, if we're relying on Herodotus for accuracy, we've got to be very careful. Other sources aren't much better, but we'll go with the stated 300,000 men. It's probably less, but it's still a chunky force. Now, the reason he stayed in Greece, his motives are not necessarily that clear. I mean, arguably this is not a tiny force. By Persian standards it's not the army of all Asia, but it's not an insignificant force, so his motives can be questioned. Is he there to protect the Persian retreat? Is this a rearguard action to allow the remnants of Xerxes' army to get back to Persia? Quite possibly. Is he there to hold on to this new territory? He spends the winter in areas of Greece that the Persians technically have now conquered. So is he there as a placeholder to keep them, just a reminder from them now under Persian control? With an army of 300,000 men, is he there to attempt a further conquest of Greece? Is he there to wait for Xerxes' reinforcements, or are these 300,000 men deemed enough to tackle the Peloponnesians? Because effectively, with the burning of Athens, it's the Peloponnesians who are the main threat. Again, on a more personal level, we could see that given that Xerxes has run and Mardonius feels a degree of responsibility for this campaign, they took his northern route, he was the one pushing for it, there's also, we can suggest, a degree of his honour at stake. He's there to redeem his perceived failings. So, it's 479, Mardonius is in Greece with an army of 300,000 men, and it's not until the end of the summer that he actually starts to make a move. He spends the majority of the year simply camped. So the end of summer, this is the start of the traditional campaigning season in the ancient world, particularly around ancient Greece. This is the time when everyone goes to war. So he moves his forces south into Attica towards Athens, again pushing further south. Moves towards Athens, and he burns it to the ground again. I mean, this is a complete nonsense, arguably, because, it's only a year since they burnt it the first time. There's not going to be too much to burn. Realistically, rather than, hating scaffolding and builders. It's more symbolic than that. So he burns Athens to the ground again. But, just as before, this is not their first time. The Athenians had fled, so it's a frustration move. So Xerxes moves south, the Athenians have run off, he burns Athens just for the hell of it. So with the return of the Persians, the Hellenic League are faced with pretty much the same problems that they had the previous year. Where to fight. And again, I'm sorry if this sounds repetitive, but imagine being part of the Hellenic League and having the same argument over and over again. Again, the issue is whether or not to hold the Isthmus of Corinth. It's becoming a bit of a broken record. I mean, you can tell. The Peloponnesians and Sparta ultimately will always pop for defending the Isthmus. So the same old arguments happen again. But this time, unusually, it seems that the Peloponnesians are actually persuaded to move north into Attica and engage the Persians. There's no real clear explanation from this from Herodotus. They just seem to think it's a good idea. So they're going to go and they're fighting the Persians in Attica. And the Persians' new allies, Thebes. Herodotus takes a significant chunk out of his time to point out that Thebes are now what he describes as firm friends with the Persians. Clearly their Medization has not sat well. There are issues behind this, and we'll cover that when we look specifically at Herodotus as a source. Needless to say, the Thebans are always going to get painted with the Medizer brush. What's particularly important here, though, with this new stage this final stage in the Persian War, is leadership. There is a significant shift. It's going to be a land battle, so Sparta are firmly in their position as leaders. But this brings a problem. Leonidas is still dead, he's not coming back from the grave anytime, so the combined force are led by a bloke called Pausanias. Now, Pausanias is, he's interesting, he's a regent, he's not the king. Sparta has two kings, he's neither of them, he is related to the king. And he is chosen to lead the army. Now, it's a strange quirk of Spartan law that only a king can lead the army into battle. Obviously, the death of Leonidas and not having an old enough heir to take the job on, that's left a few problems. So Sparta have had to cobble together an idea quite quickly. So Pausanias emerges. He's not the king, he's a regent, but he's actually really quite important. He's going to be leading this combined force. So he becomes quite prominent. So let's set the scene for this upcoming battle. After burning what is left of Athens, the Persians head toward Plataea. Remember, Plataea is Athens' ally from Marathon, and clearly the Plataeans are not going to get away scot-free. We can argue that there's still a degree of revenge going on here as motivation. So the Persians, before they actually reach Plataea, they camp across the Asopus River, and they effectively set up a position where they will wait for the Greeks to do something about it. So you have this kind of standoff where neither side wants to give away their hand at first. So they're waiting for the Greeks to do something about it. And do something they do. So the Spartans, now led by Pausanias, lead a large combined force up to the Asopus River of just short of apparently 40,000 hoplites. These are the very heavily armed Greek infantry. So although at the time there is a strong Athenian contingent, there's 8,000 Athenians apparently on the battlefield, the majority of this army are Peloponnesians. And it's not so much of a surprise given the Athenian drive to the sea, the fact that much of Greece is now under Persian occupation. There's going to be obviously a quite heavy Peloponnesian slant to this combined force. But a showing of 8,000 Athenians is significant, given the investment they've had in naval warfare. Either way, this is arguably one of the largest armies the Hellenic League has been able to muster. They're heavily armed, they're motivated, and they're here to do something about these Persians. but they are still massively outnumbered. So to battle. The Greeks form themselves up, obviously, on one side of the river in three distinct units, three distinct phalanxes, opposite sides of the river to the Persians. They've got a plan. Here we can see, even though he's not a king, Pausanias and Sparta actually are offering some real leadership in this battle, which is unusual. Obviously, aside from Leonidas' sacrifice at Thermopylae, there's a strong argument to say that Sparta did pretty poorly as leaders of the Hellenic League, but here is a good example of, they're actually stepping up, they're offering some real leadership, and they're doing their job as military hegemon. They've got a plan, they're leading a combined force, all they need to do now is win. So Pausanias' initial plan, it's a multifaceted plan, but the starting point of his plan is to try and draw the Persians across the river. He doesn't want his heavy hoplite troops getting bogged down in the river. Crossing the Esopus would potentially be a bit of a disaster. It also means that getting the Persians to ford the river, there'll only be certain points in the river where they can effectively cross. This is going to disrupt any Persian formation that they would have. It means they're effectively funneling across the river. There's going to be a bit of chaos, there's going to be a bit of a delay. One thing we do know about the Persian army is they're not great under pressure, and they're not great at keeping formation. So this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to disrupt the Persians. In comparison, though, the Greeks will hold their formations quite clearly, quite rigidly. They are much better at doing this anyway, but they're not moving. This is really important as well, because if we look at the map of Plataea, unlike somewhere like Thermopylae or the failed attempt at Tempe, there is no narrow pass here. There is real danger that the Persians, with their significant numbers, will be able to engulf or outflank the Greek phalanxes, in which case they are pretty much doomed. So it's important to Pausanias that he controls the choice of battlefield, so this does not happen. So his aim is to draw the Persians across onto a place where he chooses to fight, and just to make sure this is the right kind of thing to do, just to make sure his plan's all good and legit, he checks with his military advisors, which, it should be pointed out, are the gods. All the way throughout this battle we're told that Pausanias regularly makes sacrifice as a way of validating his military strategy. I said, if nothing else, the Spartans are deeply, deeply religious people, if not the most practical. Chopping up a goat on the middle of a battlefield, arguably no one's got time for that, Pausanias, but it works out all well. Now, as the battle enters its next obvious stage, the Greeks make quite a noticeable retreat. You can see that on the map that's on your screen. But it's not just a retreat, they also split their forces quite significantly. Now this is important because this importantly splits the Persian forces. The Spartans draw Mardonius and his elite troops to a low ridge where they then start to hold a defensive line. Again, has a quick sacrifice, checks with the gods, sees if this is a good idea. Luckily the gods say it is. So the Spartans are able to form a defensive line on a low ridge as the Persians come and attack them. Effectively they're doing what they wanted, they're drawing the Persians towards them. And this is pretty standard stuff from what we've seen of Persian and Greek conflicts before. Hoplites versus immortals, We know that the individual Persian troops are going to be no match for a heavily armoured, angry Greek man in bronze armour. But similarly, the Persians have got the numbers, they've got the ranged weapons, they prefer the bows and arrows, so it's pretty standard stuff. What's most interesting, however, is what's happening on the other side of the battlefield. On the other side, we see the Athenians, and they're led by Aristides. He will become more important later on, trust me. Now, the Athenians are unable to join up with the Spartans and form a kind of unified front because they've been engaged by a Theban phalanx. obviously we know what the Athenian sources think about the Thebans, and here's a good reason why. So this is a much more closely fought, harder contested part of the battle. The two sides are more equally matched. It's not a case of hoplites and immortals. You've got hoplites and hoplites. You've got a real hard fought clash of heavy infantry on this left hand side of the battlefield. Whereas we can suggest that we have an idea how the right hand side of the battlefield with the Spartans versus the Persians is going to turn out. This is much more dicey. This is a lot harder to call because they're so equally matched. The other thing as well we do need to bear in mind when we look at this kind of physical clash between Athens and Thebes, ultimately this will help us understand the views of the Thebans in Herodotus, given his use of primarily Athenian sources. So the battle now starts to begin to enter its final stage, where Pausanias receives favourable omens to advance. We should point out goats do not count on the casualty list, although there will have been numerous sacrifices made. So they're given the go-ahead to advance from their defensive ridge, and the Spartans push back against the Persian forces. At the same time, on the other side of the battlefield, it's a less obvious movement, but the Athenians are slowly starting to wear down the Thebans. Again, remember, that's much harder fought on that side. But the really decisive moment comes when Mardonius is killed. So Herodotus gives us the story of Mardonius. He's there, prancing around on the battlefield, leading his troops on a lovely white horse, when he's killed by a Spartan slave throwing a rock. It's an inglorious death, no doubt. When we talk about Spartan slave, presumably these are the Helots. Helots are effectively Greek slaves who are from Messenia and, Spartan slaves, but they did serve a purpose in conflict as what were called skiritai. They'll have been light infantry, and he's not just chucking any old random rock. It's not some, it's not some slave just chucking a brick. He will have been a slinger. These were really quite vicious weapons. A very skilled slinger could easily take down someone like Mardonius, who makes a really nice target, sat on his nice shiny white horse above everyone else. What happens then with the death of Mardonius is, again, what we've seen before from the Greeks and from the Persians particularly. When things don't go to plan, we see a complete crumbling of the Persian forces. Without a clear leader, without their man who can, they just collapse. They start to panic, they run, they retreat. Effectively, the death of Mardonius means the end of the battle. We've seen this before. When Xerxes flees, that's it, it's all over. The Persians fall into disarray. Ultimately, you could suggest that it seems the way to defeat the Persian army doesn't matter their numbers, take away their leader, because what we see in the Persian wars is there's a real kind of lack of chain of command. Once the main leader dies, it's almost like there's no provisional plan for what should happen next. So the Persians collapse and they start to retreat. So with the death of Mardonius, the Thebans retreat from the battlefield and the Persians fall back to their original camp. Now, although they tried their hardest to defend this, the Greek forces continue their attack. They push into the Persian camp. And according to Herodotus, 43,000 Persians were killed. This may well be an exaggeration, but we get the idea regardless that with the death of Mardonius and the collapse of the Persian plan, it's a bloodbath. Very similar to what we've seen at Marathon 10 years before. So what few Persians do survive begin their long trek back to Persia, taking this northern route. They go through Thessaly and then through Thrace, where they are continually harassed and attacked. Casualties all the way through. I mean, really, this last straggly force that comes back over the Hellespont, This is certainly a long way from the all-powerful invasion force that marched the same route and headed south just a year beforehand. So with the Battle of Plataea, the Greeks have defeated what remained of the Persian force on the Greek mainland. What was left of this army of all Asia, this flower of Persian youth, has been left tattered and battered and limping back to Persia in rags. This effectively brings to an end the Persian Wars. But there's more. So, Plataea certainly put an end to the threat of the Persian army and any Persian forces still within mainland Greece. But don't forget, the Persians had a navy too. So, following the Battle of Salamis, not Persia's finest moment, the Persian navy had spent the winter in Samos to recover and repair from their pasting at Salamis, or maybe to gear up and refit for another campaign. We're not entirely sure. Either way, they've retreated to Samos to repair their ships, to lick their wounds. Now, to ensure the Persians weren't able to relaunch another attack by sea, the Greek navy, which is now under the command of the Spartan king Leotychides, they spend the winter at Delos. It's a sacred island, but it's also uniquely placed in that it is slap bang in the middle of the Aegean. So the idea is that a Greek navy could intercept any Persian force before it gets anywhere near mainland Greece. So with the increased activity of Mardonius in Greece, Leotychides decides that he's not going to wait any longer. He hears about Mardonius moving south, burning Athens. He sees this as indication that the Persians are once again on a war footing. He expects that the navy is going to start heading towards Greece, so he decides to do something about it. He doesn't wait any longer, and now he starts to press the advantage against the Persians, and the Greek navy sets sail for Samos. So as word of the approaching Greek fleet spreads, the people on the island of Samos, who themselves, let's not forget, they are Ionian Greeks, they are ethnically and culturally Greek, they begin to revolt. So for them, they see this, again, we're back to repeating ideas and the same thing again. They see this as another fine opportunity to break away and gain some independence from Persia. Arguably a better option than during the Ionian Revolt, because at this point you've got the entire Greek fleet heading your way. And of course Samos is an island. So, Samian Revolt and the motives behind that aside, as a result of this revolt and this uprising, the Persian fleet flee the island and they take shelter on the nearby Maikali Peninsula. It's worth pointing out here that the actions of Samos, this uprising, this revolt, not too unexpected. Again, already in this brief period, we've just said it's a repeating of the same thing over and over again. What we've seen in this already brief period, we're 11 years into the century, into the period study. One of the key issues is this, that will dominate the century, is the allegiance of these Ionian Greeks. They start off as part of the Persian Empire, then they break away, then they go back, and now we see Samos is breaking away again. And given Samos' strength as a naval power, which they massively were at the time, and the fact that it's an island, with the arrival of the Greek fleet, and don't forget as well, the weakness of the Persian fleet. I mean, Persia is not far from crippled at this point. This seems to them like the ideal time to throw off their Persian rulers. We've got a new king who's just failed miserably. His army of all Asia is in pieces. You know, he can't raise 3 armies to go and crush a revolt like Darius did. For the Samians, now is the time to break away and start a new life as Greeks rather than members of the Persian Empire. And obviously this idea is going to spread. Anyway, back to the small issue of the Battle of Maikali. What follows next is unusual in that this is a naval battle which is not fought at sea. Equally unusual or highly sceptical is the fact that Herodotus claims this happened on the very same afternoon as the Battle of Plataea was being fought. We've got no way of verifying this. It seems like a bit of a stretch if that was the case. Either way, these two events largely happened simultaneously. Plataea defeats the Persian army, Maikali is going to defeat the Persian navy. So, on this peninsula, on the beaches at Maikali, to protect the ships, because again, don't forget these ships have been severely damaged, they're not really ship-shaped, the Persians have beached them, which is not uncommon, protect them from the sea, protect them from other ships, and they built a palisade wall around them. Now, a palisade is not a particularly clever thing, it's not a pointless thing, it's a relatively straightforward thing. A palisade wall is a simple fortification made with effectively logs with pointy ends that you stick into the ground. You make a big wooden fence, and if you can, you secure it up with earthworks and ramparts. It's a very temporary fortification. It will do a job for a time. Later the Romans use this as the basis of their military encampments. When they camp at night, they build a temporary wall around the ship. The Greeks land, seeing that there's no ships in the sea to sink, and led by the Spartans and King Leotychides, the Greek forces simply go about assaulting these very makeshift fortifications. As with the other land battles we've seen, the Persians stand very little chance. I mean, worst in this case, because they've got nowhere to run to. They have walled themselves in around their ships. They stand very little chance. We see Persian sailors pitted against well-trained, heavily armoured Greek soldiers, who, it is fair to say, are something on a roll at this point, having driven the Persians out of Greek waters. Similarly, the surviving Persians will probably be feeling a bit down that hill, a bit down in the dumps, because they're effectively feeling abandoned, and even in the relative safety within the confines of the Persian Empire, they're not safe from the pesky Greeks. So the Greeks simply attack the Persian fortifications and do what they do best, start slaughtering Persians en masse. So at the Battle of Maikali now, with the Persian navy now completely out of action, the threat to Greece from Xerxes is now so minuscule it may as well be non-existent, finally bringing to an end the Persian Wars. So really we need to bring all this together then. So if we look at the big things going on, arguably, interestingly here, for the first time at Plataea, we see the Greeks have been successfully working together. We've got a combined force that works effectively against the Persians. Equally unusual in both cases, in both battles, Plataea and Maikali, we see that Sparta have arguably regained their position as leaders of the Hellenic League. They are calling the shots, they're not handing over to Themistocles anymore, they are acting like leaders, and not only that, they're getting the glory and the victory to go along with this. Aside from the kind of inter-Greek relations, we can see that although Xerxes and the Persians are definitely no longer a massive threat, they're no longer the threat they were anyway, these events, the end stages of the Persian Wars, now that you take Xerxes out of the way and this threat of invasion, these events simply lead to kind of other questions in the Greek world about what comes next. Once you take Xerxes or the Persians out of the equation, you're left with some very, very deep issues to deal with. I mean, the first one, what happens next? Do the Greeks simply return back to the status quo now that the Persians have gone? Are we going back to a world where they effectively press a reset button? Sparta are still the dominant force, Athens are on the rise. What do they do? I mean, certainly Sparta would be quite happy with that, their traditional return to their position of power in the Peloponnesian League. Athens less likely. they've obviously become quite increasingly ambitious. We saw this after the Battle of Marathon, we'll see it again after the Persian Wars. The other issue as well, that the Athenians can't go back to square one, is that Athens has been burnt, so there's going to be a significant amount of reconstruction to be done. Similarly, we're back to this idea of the Thucydides trap. Are the Athenians going to use the Persian Wars to propel themselves almost ahead of Sparta, or certainly to challenge Sparta's position as leaders of the Greek world more so? Spoiler alert, yes, of course they do. That's not a surprise. We've also got to consider, well, what do you do with Thebes and the other Medises? Thebes particularly, they were members of the Hellenic League, and if we think back to the terms of the Hellenic League, the punishment for leaving the Hellenic League is death. Should Thebes actually be burnt and put to death? Or the enslavement and slaughter of its people? Is Greece willing to do that? Do the Greek people have the stomach for this? But also at the same time, what do the Greeks do about their Ionian cousins over in Persia? What do they do about these new uprisings in Asia Minor, like Samos? Do they leave it? Do they take advantage? We're back to 490 again. 499 again with the Ionian Revolt, part 2. But also, we've got to remember the rest of the Greek world, and the Persian world, to be fair, has changed. Because where do Persia go now? Xerxes is safe, but his army's in pieces. The army of all Asia is now effectively a graveyard of all Asia. So they're no longer going to be able to play a major part. So what we'll see coming up is, how do the Greeks address these questions that ultimately the end of the Persian War has left them with? So there you have it, a quick look at the Persian Wars Part 3, the Battle of Plataea and the Battle of Maikali. Hopefully this has been useful. As always, leave us a comment below, and until next time, goodbye.